The new DC, or the New York Times Bureau, we're living here. We call it the Barry Weiss Center for Independent Thinking. No, my talk is about the marginalization of Jews in European history at the Rothschild Center.
David, if I may, because the acoustics are so bad, could you articulate?
Oh, wow, okay.
Thank you.
Oui, un peu. Okay, I have a lot to say, but I will try to speak slowly and articulate. And I'm going to start in the bishop's honor with some scripture, which from the book of Jeremiah. And the situation is the Jews have been exiled from what is now Israel. Solomon's temple has been destroyed, and they're all sent off to Babylon. And Jeremiah gives them some instructions on how to live in exile. And so the passage is, build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you in exile. Pray to the Lord, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. And that idea, seek the peace and prosperity of the city you're in, according to Rabbi Sachs, from whom I got this, was a very original idea. The idea that you could be what Sachs calls a creative minority. That you could be in a city, not of it, but contributing to it even while being a separate group. And it's occurred to me over the last day and a half that this sense of being a minority, this sense of being in exile, is now an almost universal sensation. That everybody in some way or another feels like they're a minority. And I think this has come about and have a minority mentality. And this has come about in part because of demographic change. We're in a lot of countries where there is no dominant demographic majority. Loosening restrictions on gender identity. So a lot of people feel they're a part of gender minorities. Secularism. Religious people, certainly in Europe, but also in the US, evangelicals feeling they're a minority. Meritocracy. A lot of people who were in the middle class consider themselves minority in a culture run by the highly educated elites. And then just loss of social trust, as Matthew was saying. When you feel you're in a distrusting society, you feel like you can't trust the established institutions, and you feel a little like a persecuted minority. And then finally, minority status, as Matthew said, I thought one of the things that's worth the trip, that sentence where you said, when you defined wokeism as the sacralization of minorities. That was a very good description, I think, not on the right and on the left, where people seek out minority status, even if they're not, and Thomas and I would agree, I'm not sure other people would agree, but this concept of people of color is 80% of the world saying, yeah, we're oppressed minorities, but it's 80% of the world. And in my view, the phrase people of color adheres to no reality. The people in the different communities have very different lives, very different stories, very different statistics about them. But it's the assumption, no, I'm a minority. So I began thinking over the course of the last day and a half, so what is the minority mentality? And I think we've heard ripples of what it is throughout the conversation. The first, awareness. If you're a member of a minority, you're just more aware of your surroundings than you were if you assume the majority, and identity is not a problem for you. Second, an acute awareness of status arrangements. An acute awareness of how your group is being treated versus other groups. So it's a comparative mentality, as well as an acute fear of loss of group identity. That when you're a minority, you're afraid of being assimilated into the mass and losing your group identity. So how do groups react to being in minority status? Well, Jews have long experience with this. There was a time when the Maccabees were fighting the Hellenists, when the Hellenic and Roman empires were big, and they broke off into 4 different tendencies, which I think are extremely common for minority groups. First, there were the assimilationists, the people who basically liberalized so much they almost shed their group identity. Second, retreat, get as far away from the dominant group as possible. So in those days, Jews went to the deserts. If you've been in Israel, they went to Qumran, they went to the caves, and they retreated. Third, combat, fight the majority, and that's what the Maccabees did. They fought. They demanded a sort of pure identity of Jewish authenticity, and they fought. And then fourth, hybrid. be a Jew in the city. And I think that's sort of what Jeremiah is asking us to do, to embrace a layered identity which is Jewish but still of the city. Now, Jeremiah should have gone into more detail because how you actually do that is actually unclear and has been the source of contention. How much do you assimilate? Who's a good Jew and who's betraying the Jews? You have multiple loves that pull you in opposite directions. You have an intense fear of rejection for the dominant culture that you're trying to assimilate into. You have anxiety, you're betraying your own group. You have anxiety about, will you survive in pluralism? Will your group survive? And you have self-complexity that become a parallel force. And I think all minority groups, and now that's almost everybody, go through this psychological process. The two minorities I know best, one I'm part of and one I have lived around all my life being American, are blacks and Jews. Blacks and Jews have a lot of experience with minority. And I think in both communities, there's all these four tendencies, or in all four. And so for Judaism, Jews are used to living in places where civilizations combine. If you're a minority group, it's just safer to be in Istanbul than it is to be in a homogeneous place. And so you live at these cultural verges, is the word, where you get extreme dynamism of culture. And so we talk about Saul Bellow and Philip Roth, putting aside how they treated women, they're wrestling with how to be Jew in America and how to be both those things. And so I think it has a tremendous propulsive force, a very creative force. To be a creative minority, it really drives an intense dynamism. And so you got all these Jewish Nobel Prize winners, movie directors, writers, intense achievement, as people are both trying to fit in and stand out. My own story, I had a great uncle named Irving Browning. He lived in the Heights, in Washington Heights, where Lin-Manuel Miranda is from. And he became a movie director in the 20s. And that was when they made movies on the beach in Atlantic City. And he made Westerns. And so he directed Westerns. And when you went with all the big Hollywood stars in that era, Valentino, Lillian Gish, all these people, went to his apartment in the Heights, it looked like you were in Montana in 1860. It was all Western gear. He had rifles, he had powder horns. You really felt there was a big picture of him in chaps with a lasso. He just loved the West. The man himself never went west of the Hudson River. He had no idea what he was talking about. And that's very common. There's a book called How Jews Invented America, that they had this imagination of what America was, and they invented it. And then the cowboys said, okay, that's how we made it. So they put on chaps and had lassos and stuff like that. And so that's a creative minority. And Thomas and I are fans of a guy named Albert Murray, a black writer, who was friends with Ralph Ellington and other. And he wrote this book we both admire called The Omni-Americans. And it's about how blacks were a creative minority in America. And one of my favorite passages about that is about the blues and the blues culture. And he says, when you're swinging the blues, you are not avoiding the hard parts about being black in America, but you're facing them with a heroic and exemplary response. And that's a good description of what creative minorities do. And so I think it has also led to insane dynamism. I mean, one fact I was thinking about last night, I hope this is not a dangerous fact, when you think about the most famous human beings on earth over the last 40 years. So in the 70s, Muhammad Ali was probably the most famous human being on earth. In the 80s, Michael Jackson. In the 90s, Michael Jordan. In the 2000s, Barack Obama. So like Americans are 5% of the world, African Americans are 12% of that 5%. So how weird is it that the most famous human beings for 4 decades were African Americans? Like that shows a lot of dynamism. And that's setting aside all the other ways our culture is shaped. So to me, the 90s, I felt very nostalgic for the 90s as we've been talking. Because it was peaceful, I was in Europe, the wall was falling down, and we all thought we were going to have layered identities. We thought pluralism had won. Then along comes 9/11, and a lot of doctors and engineers decided, no, I'm not for a hybrid identity. I'm going to invent a past for my own culture, and then I'm going to destroy the others. And so liberalism became a problem. Multiple identities became a problem. And Mark had said, which I wrote down, it's the plasticity of the Jews that is the problem. You never know who they are, They can be capitalist or communist, but they're still Jewish. The plasticity is synonymous with modernity. That's what Jews are. And that's not only true of Jews, I think that's true of a lot of our different groups. And that we've come to stand for modernity, stand for layered identities. And that has been rejected by a lot of people. First, the rejection of layered identity for being a wave of rootless cosmopolitanism. That was Albert Murray in the back. Second, a rejection of hybrid individualism within groups within groups saying you're not authentically whatever, and enforcing boundaries, that you can't be hybrid if that means you're not really one of us. Third, and I was just at the National Conservatism Conference, and their core argument was you people with layered identities, yeah, you're living in a fantasy land. The world is not really like that. The story of history is the story of combat between groups. We really do not have the luxury of hybrid identities. They despise us, they're out to get us. You hybrid people, you pluralistic people are abandoning the barricades. You got to stand strong with us in one unitary force. And I mean, Mark also said he got isolated because of his Jewish name at his magazine at the Rolling Stone of France. And that's like, no, we're in the barricades, we can't afford this. Your people are, you're either oppressed or oppressed. And fourth, there's a tendency to simply see over pluralism to the other extreme. So for the national conservatism, moderates don't really exist. There's the woke army and then there's their army. And all the people in the middle are sort of invisible and rendered invisible in their worldview. And they want Manichaean combat and they make it so. And finally, there's a fear from people whose identity is formed by nationalist binding creeds that these creeds are being weakened, that they're being replaced by nothing, that there's no core to the nation if you weaken and pluralize the identity. So how will this wind up? Well, here, I don't know what I'm talking about, and none of us do, but just a few speculations. One is I remain, for those of us on the pluralistic side who believe in hybrid identity with all its difficulties, I still think we're the majority. Somebody quoted the More in Common study, and I wrote a column on it called The Rich White Civil War, because the people who are the most Manichaean on either side are rich, highly educated white people, both on the left and on the right. And the people in the middle are dealing with it, and I think they're finding a way. And I think the woke are, to the extent we're using that word as shorthand, that's like 8%. I think the Trumpian, the hardcore national conservatives are like 8%. The rest of the people are just trying to figure out something in between. Second, as I mentioned to somebody last night, I have awesome faith in the power of capitalism to co-opt all ideologies. And so, to me, woke capitalism or national conservatism, capitalism will co-opt that. What started out as Led Zeppelin is now playing it the safe way. Like, I think that'll happen. And third, I just think for people with these unitary identities on the populist side or on what they think of as their opposite side, there's just a crime of anecdotalism. Like you find a story a day on Twitter that offends your sensibility, and you take those story a day and you wield it into a view of reality. And so I would say, I don't know what it's like for the populists in Europe, when there was an attack on the schools being co-opted in Virginia by, Ibram Kendi, it was never clear to me, and frankly, I haven't seen good reporting on this, how much of that is actually happening. I really don't think it's happening all that much. I mean, there are clear racial categories have shifted, but it's really hard to tell how big the problem is. And so most school classrooms, I'm sure they're like nice teachers who believe in America but want to teach about race. Like, this is not hard. And so I have a basic belief that's all gonna calm down. And so I remain, which is my job at the New York Times, of being wildly, irrationally, and hopelessly optimistic. People dismiss me constantly for that reason. And then finally, I would say the side of pluralism has begun rallying. So wisdom of crowds, persuasion, frankly, the Atlantic, to some degree, like a third of the New York Times. And so I do think, and I'll close with this, is that what needs to happen is there needs to be like we had this debate about culture and economics. And in my background, I think about those two things, but I think more about spirituality and psychology. So in this talk, I've tried to talk about the psychology of being a creative minority. But I think the gap and what people are really panicking about is a sense of spiritual vacuity, that they're losing a spiritual core that tells them how to be a good person. And I was drawn to Bishop Zach's emphasis on human dignity. And I've been helped I think the fundamental thing we need now is a common moral vision that does not grow out of the culture war. That is not part of that dynamic one way or the other. And in searching for that thing, and that's what a lot of people in this room does. My wife's magazine Comment is really all about that, how to be spiritually rich in angry times. And Anne's magazine doesn't fight the culture war, it just is different. It's trying to be positive and progressive and figure out common problems. And the bishop's emphasis on human dignity, I really think it all comes down to, and the question is whether a secular society can embrace this, is made in the image of God. If you treat everybody like they're made in the image of God, you'll treat them well. And the question is whether that's possible to do that in secular societies. And I tell my secular friends, there's some piece of you that has no size, weight, color, or shape, but gives you infinite value and dignity. You don't have to believe in God to believe this. And that's your soul. And if you treat people like they have souls, then you'll end up treating them well. But somehow that spiritual vacuum, I think, has to be filled. And I've been helped, just for the French people in the room, by a movement called Pluralism, which grew up in the 1930s in France, led by people like Emmanuel Magnier, a little Jacques Maritain, maybe a little followed up by Jean-Paul II. And it's an entire philosophy and social movement based on the dignity, the infinite dignity of each person, a refusal to see people as groups only. And to me, we've overgrouped and returning to a moral vision based on that system is the way out of the populist versus left nationalist war. So that's my summary.